video, we'll be talking about database access methods. So by the end of the lesson, you'll be able to create modular database access methods to use in your API. I have pulled up here a pretty standard code base that has two different endpoints, a get API users and get API users by ID. So in these two examples, we're writing our database logic directly into our endpoints. So I've gone ahead and configured connects in this config file, exported it, and then imported that into my server so that I can use connects methods to access my database. Now, of course, we definitely want to access our database in order to perform these CRUD operations, but what's not so ideal is to do the database access step directly in the endpoint. The theme of this video is modular code. And in general, we want to find ways to make our code modular, but a really good rule of thumb when it comes to database access is that we want anything that deals directly with the database to be in a separate file in separate methods. This makes our code more dry, clean, easier to read, and easier to test. So let's go ahead and refactor these two endpoints. So we're going to try to redo these so that instead of writing our connects logic directly in, we're actually putting all that logic somewhere else. So I'm going to create a new file in here called dbhelpers. And this whole accessing the database thing really should be happening in here. In fact, I'll even remove this from our server. We don't want any DB stuff happening in here. So within the DB helper file, we want to create some helper functions. We could create a find, which finds all users, and maybe a find by ID function. So for find, we're really just interested in a master list of all users. So we can do return DB users. So this function, because all database access is going to be a promise, will return a promise that resolves to an array of users. Now in find by ID, there's two different ways we could do this. We could always do DB users where ID, and this would resolve to an array containing a single user or an empty array if the ID is invalid. So that's a fine way to do find by ID, but it might be better if instead of resolving to an array, we just actually returned that single user. There are a few different ways to do this, but the easiest one is to use a connects method called first. So we've just changed the behavior of our helper, so now that this resolves to a single user or null if the ID is invalid. So we've just created these two helper methods that we could use elsewhere in our code base. Let's export them so that we can use them. So now we can jump back over to our server file and actually import this. And instead of doing the actual raw connects code in here, we could call user.find. And over here, we could call user.findById and pass in our ID. Now, one little note is remember that find by ID actually resolves to a user, a single object, instead of an array. So we'll have to actually refactor this to say user, and if the user exists, then we can send it back. Otherwise, we can send back this invalid user ID message. Let's talk about why we want to do this. Because you might be saying to yourself, well, user.find is really the same amount of code as just using the connects logic, and find by ID isn't much better. Well, we want to think about the bigger picture. When someone's going through our code base, they should be able to know where all the direct database logic lives. And if it's scattered in a number of files, that's going to be really hard to do. So in this manner, we can actually find the root of where the database access is happening really quickly. Another reason for doing it this way is testability. In this way, we'd actually be able to separately test these helpers and test the endpoints differently. So if something's going wrong, it'd be really clear where the issue is happening. Is it happening on the database access level, or is it happening in our endpoint logic? That type of thinking will make more sense once you actually get into testing. But the more separate we can keep things, the better, is a good rule of thumb for making sure you're writing testable code. Finally, even though these two methods are pretty simple logic-wise, a lot of the time we'll be having fairly sophisticated database logic. Things that might be using joins or actually manipulating the data in some way using JavaScript, and we wouldn't want that all in our endpoint. It would start to get really cluttered. So even getting in the habit with some of these simpler methods will help us a lot when we start to do more complex database operations.